May 13th, 2019. In a modest house in Carmel by the sea, surrounded by the dogs she loved more than any human had ever loved her, Doris Day drew her final breath at 97 years old. The woman who had embodied American optimism for 6 decades, whose golden voice had carried the nation through wars and heartbreak with songs of hope and resilience, died as she had lived her private life, quietly, away from the spotlight that had both blessed and cursed her. The official cause was pneumonia. But those who had known the real Doris understood that she had been dying slowly for years, worn down by decades of maintaining a smile that had never quite reached her soul. The sunshine girl of Hollywood, whose radiant performances had convinced millions that happiness was always just a song away, had spent her final years as a virtual recluse, emerging only to care for abandoned animals who, unlike the men in her life, had never betrayed her trust. The irony was as bitter as it was complete. Doris Day, whose signature song proclaimed "Que sera, sera, no, whatever will be," had spent most of her adult life fighting desperately against whatever would be, struggling to maintain control in a world that seemed determined to exploit her optimism and punish her for the joy she brought to others. Her Carmel home, filled with rescued dogs and cats, told the story of a woman who had learned that animals possessed the loyalty she had never found in husbands, managers, or the Hollywood machine that had made her famous. The walls were lined not with movie posters or gold records, but with photographs of the countless creatures she had saved, each one representing her real legacy, built not on entertainment but on genuine compassion. The news of her death was met with tributes from around the world, but most of the obituaries focused on the sanitized version of her story, the sunny disposition, the wholesome image, the songs that had lifted spirits during dark times. Missing from most coverage was any serious examination of the price she had paid for being America's sweetheart, the personal cost of a career built on projecting happiness while enduring private storms that would have broken lesser spirits. Was Doris Day's death the peaceful end of a life well lived? Or was it the final release for a woman who had been trapped for decades in a prison made of other people's expectations and her own inability to disappoint them? The questions that surrounded her passing were as complex as the woman herself, who had spent 7 decades convincing the world she was happy while writing in her private letters about the storms that raged constantly in her real life. But to understand how it all ended in that quiet California house, surrounded by grateful animals and blessed silence, we must first understand how it all began. In Cincinnati, Ohio, where a young girl's dreams of dancing were shattered by twisted metal and broken bones, setting her on a path toward fame that would prove both salvation and damnation. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1922. In a modest house on a tree-lined street where dreams were encouraged but rarely realized, Doris Marianne Kappelhoff entered a world that seemed designed to test the optimism that would later make her famous. Her parents, William and Alma, were hard-working German Americans who believed in the power of persistence and the possibility of better days ahead, values that would shape their daughter's approach to both triumph and tragedy. From her earliest years, Doris displayed the contradictions that would define her entire life. She was simultaneously confident and vulnerable, ambitious and accommodating, blessed with a natural joy that seemed to radiate from within, but also possessed of a deep sensitivity that made her susceptible to the cruelties of others. Teachers noted her unusual ability to make everyone around her feel better simply by being present, a gift that would prove both her greatest asset and her heaviest burden. The young Doris was tall for her age, with blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold and a smile that could transform the most ordinary moment into something magical. But more than her physical beauty, it was her spirit that made her special. An innate optimism that seemed to suggest that everything would work out if you just kept believing, kept trying, kept smiling through whatever storms life might bring. Dancing was Doris's first love, and she approached it with the kind of passionate dedication that would characterize all her future endeavors. She spent hours practicing in front of mirrors, dreaming of spotlights and applause, of stages where her movement could bring joy to others. Her parents, recognizing her talent, made sacrifices to pay for lessons, believing that their daughter possessed something rare enough to justify their faith and financial strain. The signs were there from the beginning of someone who would struggle with the burden of other people's happiness. Doris felt responsible for maintaining her family's spirits during difficult times, for being the light that kept everyone else from despair. She learned early that her joy could be a form of service, that her smile was something she owed to others rather than something she gave freely. Could anyone have predicted, watching this radiant child dance through her Cincinnati childhood, that she would spend her adult life feeling guilty every time she wasn't happy? That success would become a form of imprisonment rather than liberation? The qualities that made her special, her empathy, her desire to please, her instinctive understanding of what others needed, were the same traits that would make her vulnerable to exploitation and abuse throughout her career. At 14, everything changed with the screech of brakes and the sickening crunch of metal against bone. The car accident that shattered Doris's leg also shattered her dreams of becoming a professional dancer. But in forcing her to find a new path, it inadvertently launched one of the most successful entertainment careers in American history. During the long months of recovery confined to bed with her leg in traction, Doris discovered that she could sing. Her voice, rich and warm and filled with the same optimism that had characterized her dancing, provided comfort not just for herself but for everyone who heard it. She began singing along to radio shows, transforming her bedroom into an imaginary nightclub where she could perform for audiences who existed only in her imagination. The transformation from dancer to singer was both practical and metaphorical. Unable to express her joy through movement, Doris channeled it into her voice, creating a sound that seemed to embody hope itself. But the accident had also taught her a crucial lesson about the fragility of dreams and the need to be prepared for disappointment, knowledge that would make her both more resilient and more vulnerable to the setbacks that lay ahead. When she was finally able to walk again, Doris's injured leg had healed crooked, ending forever her dreams of professional dancing. But her voice had grown stronger during the months of recovery, and she began performing at local venues, where audiences were immediately captivated by her ability to make even the saddest songs sound like promises of better days ahead. Her first professional break came when she auditioned for a spot on a Cincinnati radio station, performing songs that showcased not just her technical ability, but her innate understanding of how music could heal. The station manager was so impressed that he offered her a regular spot, and suddenly Doris found herself with a new career and a new dream. But even as she was discovering her gifts as a performer, Doris was learning hard lessons about the music business and the men who controlled it. Radio executives and nightclub owners saw her youth and optimism as assets to be exploited rather than protected. And she began experiencing the first tastes of the manipulation and exploitation that would plague her throughout her career. Was the accident that ended Doris's dancing career a tragedy that she overcame through resilience and talent, or was it the first of many experiences that would teach her to smile through pain and find ways to make others happy even when she was suffering? The question would echo throughout her life, as she struggled to distinguish between genuine happiness and the performance of happiness that had become second nature. By her late teens, Doris had established herself as one of Cincinnati's most promising young singers. But she was already learning that success in entertainment required more than talent. It demanded a willingness to subordinate her own needs and desires to the expectations of others. A lesson that would shape every relationship and career decision for the rest of her life. In 1939, at 17 years old, Doris made the decision that would change her life forever. She accepted an offer to join Les Brown and his Band of Renown, one of the most popular big bands in America. The opportunity represented everything she had dreamed of since her dancing career ended. National exposure, professional recognition, and the chance to bring her music to audiences across the country. But leaving Cincinnati also meant leaving behind everything familiar and safe, stepping into a world where her youth and inexperience would make her vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The music industry of the late 1930s was notorious for its treatment of young female singers, who were often seen as decorative objects rather than serious artists, valued more for their appearance than their talent. Doris's early experiences with the Les Brown Orchestra were both exhilarating and educational. She was working with professional musicians at the highest level, performing in venues she had only dreamed about, and receiving the kind of recognition that validated her belief in her own abilities. But she was also learning about the darker side of show business, the casual cruelty of music executives, the exploitation of young performers, and the assumption that her success was dependent entirely on maintaining her image as a wholesome, approachable girl next door. Her breakthrough song, Sentimental Journey, became a massive hit in 1945. Transforming Doris from a promising young singer into a national sensation. The song, with its themes of homecoming and hope, perfectly captured the mood of a nation welcoming its soldiers home from World War II, and Doris's warm, optimistic delivery made her voice synonymous with the joy of reunion and the promise of peaceful times ahead. But success also brought new pressures and responsibilities. Doris found herself expected to embody the happiness she sang about, to be living proof that the optimism in her music was genuine and sustainable. Audiences wanted to believe that someone could be as consistently joyful as her song suggested, and she felt obligated to maintain that illusion even when her private life was becoming increasingly complicated and painful. The first of her 4 marriages to trombonist Al Jordan began during this period and quickly revealed the pattern that would characterize all her romantic relationships. She was drawn to men who seemed charming and protective, but who ultimately proved to be controlling and abusive. Jordan's jealousy and violence were hidden from the public, but they began the process of teaching Doris that her personal happiness was incompatible with her professional success. Behind the scenes, those who worked with Doris noticed troubling signs. She was a perfectionist who drove herself relentlessly, always worried that she wasn't good enough, that she would disappoint the people who depended on her for their own happiness. She began developing the elaborate coping mechanisms that would sustain her through decades of private turmoil. The ability to compartmentalize pain, to perform joy convincingly even when she felt empty inside, to maintain her public image regardless of what was happening in her private life. Was Doris's success with Sentimental Journey the beginning of a career that would bring joy to millions, or was it the moment when she became trapped in a persona that would eventually consume her authentic self? The question was already becoming relevant as she struggled to balance the demands of fame with her own psychological and emotional needs. By the late 1940s, Doris Day had established herself as one of America's most beloved entertainers. But she was also beginning to understand that her success came with a price that no one had prepared her to pay. The transition from recording artist to movie star happened with the kind of Hollywood magic that seemed designed to prove that dreams really could come true. Doris's film debut in Romance on the High Seas, 1948, showcased not just her singing ability but her natural charisma and comedic timing, qualities that made her perfect for the romantic comedies that would define her movie career. But Hollywood in the 1950s was a machine designed to create and maintain illusions, and Doris quickly discovered that her film career would require her to embody an even more elaborate version of the optimistic persona she had developed as a singer. Studio executives saw her wholesome image as a valuable commodity that needed to be protected and marketed, regardless of the psychological cost to the person behind the persona. Her breakthrough film role came in Calamity Jane, 1953, where she played a rough-and-tumble frontier woman who discovers her feminine side through love. The performance was a revelation, showing that Doris could be both strong and vulnerable, independent and romantic, challenging and reassuring. But it also established the template that would govern most of her subsequent films. She would play women who seemed unconventional but who ultimately embraced traditional feminine roles and found happiness through romantic love. The song Secret Love from Calamity Jane became another massive hit and won Doris her first Academy Award, cementing her status as a major Hollywood star. But the success also intensified the pressure to maintain her image as America's sweetheart, the woman who proved that virtue and optimism were always rewarded, that true love was always possible, and that happy endings were the natural result of maintaining faith and keeping a positive attitude. Behind the cameras, Doris's personal life was becoming increasingly chaotic and painful. Her second marriage to manager Marty Melcher had begun as a seemingly perfect partnership between a talented artist and a dedicated businessman. But Melcher gradually revealed himself to be more interested in controlling Doris's career and finances than in supporting her personal happiness and artistic growth. The pattern was becoming clear. Doris was attracted to men who seemed to offer protection and stability, but who ultimately proved to be more interested in exploiting her success than in nurturing her well-being. Each marriage began with hope and ended with betrayal. But Doris felt compelled to maintain the illusion of happiness, both because her public image demanded it and because she genuinely believed that optimism and persistence could overcome any obstacle. Her film career reached its peak with a series of romantic comedies co-starring Rock Hudson, including Pillow Talk, 1959, and Lover Come Back, 1961. These films presented Doris as the perfect American woman, beautiful but not threatening, successful but ultimately willing to subordinate her career to love, independent but fundamentally traditional in her values and desires. The irony was devastating. While Doris was convincing audiences that romantic love was the answer to all of life's problems, her own marriages were teaching her that the men who claimed to love her were often the source of her greatest pain. The disconnect between her screen persona and her lived experience was growing wider with each film, creating a psychological strain that she was forced to hide from everyone around her. Did this period represent the peak of Doris's artistic achievement and personal fulfillment? Or was it the time when the gap between her public image and her private reality became insurmountably wide? Those who worked with her during these years described a woman who seemed to be simultaneously at the height of her powers and struggling with demons that she was not allowed to acknowledge publicly. The success that should have validated her dreams was instead becoming a form of imprisonment, trapping her in a version of herself that felt increasingly foreign and exhausting to maintain. By the 1960s, Doris Day had achieved everything that American culture suggested should make a person happy: fame, wealth, critical recognition, and the adoration of millions. But privately, she was discovering that none of these external accomplishments could compensate for the internal emptiness that came from living a fundamentally inauthentic life. Her third marriage to producer Martin Melcher had seemed like a solution to the problems that had plagued her earlier relationships. Melcher was successful in his own right, understood the entertainment business, and appeared to genuinely care about Doris's career and well-being. But gradually she began to realize that he was systematically taking control of every aspect of her life, making decisions about her career, her finances, and even her personal relationships without consulting her. The television series The Doris Day Show, which ran from 1968 to 1973, was supposed to represent a new phase in her career, a chance to reach audiences in a more intimate medium while maintaining greater control over her artistic choices. But the show instead became another example of how Doris's desire to please others made her vulnerable to exploitation. The series was created and controlled by Melcher, who used it as a vehicle for his own ambitions while further limiting Doris's creative freedom. More devastating was Doris's gradual realization that Melcher had been systematically embezzling from her for years. making investments without her knowledge and squandering the fortune she had earned through decades of hard work. When Melcher died suddenly in 1968, Doris discovered that she was not only grief-stricken but also virtually bankrupt, forced to continue working not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. The revelation of Melcher's betrayal was a turning point that forced Doris to confront the pattern that had defined her adult life. Her tendency to trust men who seemed to offer protection, but who ultimately proved to be predators. The optimism that had made her famous was revealed to be both her greatest strength and her most dangerous vulnerability, the quality that had allowed her to inspire others while making her susceptible to manipulation and abuse. Her fourth and final marriage to restaurateur Barry Comden followed the same tragic pattern. Comden initially appeared to be different from her previous husbands, kinder, less controlling, more interested in her happiness than in her career. But he too revealed himself to be physically and emotionally abusive, forcing Doris to endure violence while maintaining her public image as a woman who had found lasting happiness. The contradiction between her screen persona and her lived experience reached its breaking point during this period. Doris was still expected to embody American optimism and traditional feminine values, but her personal life had taught her that the promises embedded in her films and songs were often lies. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable, manifesting in health problems, anxiety, and a growing desire to escape from the public eye entirely. Behind all those bright smiles and cheerful songs, was there a woman slowly being destroyed by the very qualities that had made her successful? The question was becoming increasingly urgent as Doris struggled to maintain her career while dealing with personal betrayals that would have ended most people's faith in human nature. The tragedy was that the optimism and trust that had made her America's sweetheart were the same qualities that had made her vulnerable to a lifetime of exploitation and abuse. She was trapped in a persona that demanded constant happiness while her real life provided constant reasons for despair. The 1970s and 1980s marked Doris Day's gradual withdrawal from public life, a retreat that was both necessary for her psychological survival and devastating to a career that had been built on constant visibility and availability. After decades of being America's most accessible star, she began the long process of reclaiming her privacy and rebuilding her life away from the cameras and expectations that had defined her adult existence. The end of her television series in 1973 provided an opportunity to step back from the relentless pace of entertainment work. But Doris discovered that retirement was more complicated than she had anticipated. The financial devastation caused by Martin Melcher's embezzlement meant that she couldn't afford to stop working entirely. But she was also increasingly reluctant to take on projects that required her to maintain the cheerful persona that had become so psychologically exhausting. Her focus began shifting from entertainment to animal welfare, a cause that had always been close to her heart but that now became her primary passion and purpose. The Doris Day Animal Foundation, established in the 1970s, allowed her to channel her natural empathy and desire to help others into work that felt genuinely meaningful rather than performative. Working with animals provided Doris with something she had never found in her entertainment career or her marriages: relationships based on genuine love and loyalty rather than mutual exploitation. Dogs and cats didn't care about her image, didn't expect her to be constantly happy, and didn't try to profit from her success. They simply needed care and received it gratefully, offering in return the kind of unconditional affection that had always eluded her in her relationships with humans. The contrast was both healing and heartbreaking. Doris, who had spent decades trying to make others happy through her performances, discovered that the simplest acts of kindness toward abandoned animals brought her more satisfaction than all her professional achievements combined. She began to understand that her real calling might have been compassion rather than entertainment, that her gift for healing might have been better expressed through direct service rather than through songs and films that created illusions of happiness while masking her own pain. Her personal life during this period was characterized by increasing isolation from the Hollywood community that had made her famous. Doris became known for her reclusiveness, rarely giving interviews or making public appearances, preferring to spend her time caring for animals and managing her foundation rather than maintaining her celebrity status. The transformation was both liberation and loss. By stepping away from the public eye, Doris was finally able to live on her own terms, to make choices based on her own desires rather than others' expectations. But she was also acknowledging that the career that had defined her for 4 decades had ultimately been more burden than blessing, more imprisonment than opportunity. Can someone who has spent their entire adult life performing ever find their authentic self? Or do they remain forever marked by the roles they've played? For Doris, this question was becoming increasingly relevant as she tried to discover who she might be when no one was watching, when no one expected her to smile, when no one needed her to embody hope and optimism. The answer, it seemed, was someone quieter but more genuinely happy than the woman who had entertained millions, someone who had learned that real joy came not from performing happiness but from acts of genuine kindness performed without an audience. The final decades of Doris Day's life unfolded in remarkable contrast to the public years that had made her famous. Living in her Carmel home surrounded by rescued animals, she found a peace that had eluded her throughout her entertainment career. The woman who had spent decades maintaining a public image discovered that privacy was not just a luxury, but a necessity for psychological survival and authentic happiness. Her retreat from public life was so complete that many people assumed she had died years before her actual death in 2019. Occasionally, tabloid reporters would track her down seeking interviews or photographs, but Doris had become skilled at avoiding the media attention that had once been central to her existence. She had learned to value anonymity as much as she had once treasured fame. The animal rescue work that had begun as a side interest became her primary identity and purpose. The Doris Day Animal Foundation grew into a significant force in animal welfare advocacy, saving countless lives and promoting legislation to protect creatures who couldn't protect themselves. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Doris was doing work that aligned completely with her values and brought her genuine satisfaction without requiring her to pretend to be anyone other than herself. Friends who visited her during these years described a woman who seemed fundamentally different from the Doris Day of Hollywood legend. She was quieter, more reflective, less concerned with pleasing others and more focused on living according to her own principles. The constant anxiety that had characterized her performing years had been replaced by a hard-won serenity that came from finally being able to live authentically. But the cost of her earlier life remained evident in her continued inability to form romantic relationships. The pattern of abuse and betrayal that had defined her marriages had left her unwilling to trust men in intimate contexts, preferring the company of animals and a few close friends to the complications of romantic love. She had learned to be happy alone in ways that her younger self, who had believed so deeply in the transformative power of love, could never have imagined. Her rare public statements during this period revealed a woman who had made peace with the contradictions of her life. She acknowledged the joy she had brought to others through her entertainment career while also being honest about the personal cost of maintaining an image that had never quite matched her reality. She seemed to understand that both aspects of her story were true. She had been genuinely gifted at creating happiness for others, and that gift had prevented her from finding happiness for herself. The irony of her final years was that Doris Day, who had spent her career convincing others that optimism and persistence would solve any problem, found her own happiness only when she stopped trying to solve the problems of others and focused instead on the simple work of caring for creatures who needed help without expecting entertainment in return. Were these final decades a time of genuine peace and fulfillment, Or were they simply the exhausted aftermath of a life spent in service to others' expectations? Those who knew her best believed it was the former, that Doris had finally found a way to live that honored both her natural compassion and her need for authenticity. When she died in 2019 at the age of 97, she passed away as she had lived her later years. Quietly, surrounded by the animals she loved, having finally found a form of happiness that didn't require an audience or a performance. The news of Doris Day's death was met with an outpouring of affection and nostalgia that revealed how deeply her work had touched people around the world. Tributes poured in from fellow entertainers, politicians, and ordinary fans who credited her songs and films with helping them through difficult times. But most of these remembrances focused on the public Doris, the sunny optimist who had made everything seem possible, rather than acknowledging the more complex reality of her life and struggles. The obituaries were filled with the familiar phrases: America's sweetheart, the girl next door, eternal optimist. These descriptions weren't inaccurate, but they were incomplete, failing to capture the woman who had written privately about the storms in her real life while maintaining the sunshine persona that the world demanded from her. More meaningful were the tributes from animal welfare organizations and activists who had worked with Doris during her later years. These people had known her not as a performer, but as a dedicated advocate who had used her fame and resources to make genuine differences in the lives of creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. Their remembrances painted a picture of someone who had found her truest calling not in entertainment, but in compassion. The investigation into her estate revealed both the extent of her generosity and the lingering effects of the financial betrayal she had suffered earlier in life. Despite earning millions during her entertainment career, Doris had lived modestly in her final years, directing most of her resources toward animal welfare causes. Her will established endowments for several rescue organizations, ensuring that her work would continue long after her death. Perhaps most tellingly, her funeral was a private affair attended only by close friends and animal welfare colleagues. There was no Hollywood ceremony, no public memorial service, no attempt to turn her death into the kind of media spectacle that had characterized much of her life. She had specifically requested that her passing be marked quietly, with donations to animal charities rather than flowers or public displays of mourning. The contrast between her public funeral wishes and the elaborate celebrations that had marked her professional achievements seemed to capture the essential truth about Doris Day. She had spent most of her adult life learning to distinguish between the happiness that comes from external validation and the satisfaction that comes from authentic service to others. In the years since her death, cultural historians and entertainment scholars have begun to reassess her legacy, looking beyond the cheerful surface to examine the more complex questions her life and career had raised. They have started to acknowledge that her story was not just about talent and success, but about the particular pressures faced by women in entertainment. The psychological cost of maintaining public personas that diverge from private reality, and the ways in which American culture has historically demanded that its female stars embody impossible standards of perpetual optimism and availability. Was Doris Day's life ultimately a triumph or a tragedy? The question may be unanswerable because it was clearly both. She had achieved extraordinary success while paying an extraordinary personal price, had brought genuine joy to millions while struggling to find authentic happiness for herself, had embodied American optimism while learning hard lessons about the limits of positive thinking. Perhaps her greatest achievement was not her entertainment career, but her eventual escape from it. Her ability to find a form of happiness that didn't depend on others' approval or expectations. In the end, the woman who had spent decades convincing others that dreams come true had finally made her own dream come true. She had found a way to live quietly, authentically, surrounded by love that asked nothing of her except presence and care. The legacy of Doris Day is complex and multifaceted. encompassing both her revolutionary impact on American popular culture and the personal struggles that she largely managed to keep hidden from public view. Her career spanned a crucial period in American history, from the post-war optimism of the 1940s through the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, and her image evolved to reflect the changing expectations placed on American women during those decades. Her musical recordings remain some of the most beloved songs in American popular culture, not just because of their technical excellence, but because of their emotional authenticity. Despite the personal pain she was often experiencing while recording, Doris managed to infuse her performances with genuine feeling, creating art that resonated with listeners because it captured both the hope for happiness and the longing that comes from its absence. Her film career, particularly her romantic comedies of the 1950s and early 1960s, helped define American ideals about love, marriage, and feminine identity during a crucial period of social change. While these films now seem dated in their assumptions about gender roles, they were progressive for their time in presenting women who were intelligent, capable, and professionally successful, even if they ultimately chose traditional paths. But perhaps her most important legacy lies in the questions her life raised about the cost of fame, the pressure to maintain public personas that diverge from private reality, and the particular vulnerabilities of performers whose careers depend on embodying other people's fantasies and expectations. Her story serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale about the American dream and its discontents. The animal welfare work that defined her later years may ultimately prove to be her most lasting contribution. The organizations she founded and funded have saved countless lives and continue to advocate for creatures who cannot speak for themselves. This work represented Doris at her most authentic, using her resources and influence to serve others without expecting entertainment or gratification in return. Her retreat from public life in her later years also established an important precedent for how public figures might choose to age and find meaning beyond their celebrity careers. By prioritizing privacy, authenticity, and service over continued fame and attention, Doris demonstrated that it was possible to find happiness after living much of one's life as a public commodity. What hidden lessons might her story hold for contemporary performers and public figures who struggle with similar pressures to maintain images that may not align with their authentic selves? Her life suggests that the qualities that make someone successful in entertainment, the desire to please, the ability to embody fantasies, the willingness to prioritize others' happiness over one's own needs, can also make them vulnerable to exploitation and psychological damage. In remembering Doris Day, we must remember both the joy she brought to others and the price she paid for bringing it. Her story serves as a reminder that behind every perfect image lies a human being with complex needs and vulnerabilities, and that true happiness may require the courage to disappoint others in order to remain true to oneself. The sunshine girl who had made optimism seem effortless had actually been working very hard to maintain that illusion, and her greatest achievement may have been learning when to stop performing and start living for herself. In the quiet of her Carmel home, surrounded by grateful animals and genuine peace, Doris Day finally found the happiness that had always seemed just out of reach. Not because she had learned to be more optimistic, but because she had learned to be more honest about what she actually needed to thrive. Her final message, delivered not through songs or films, but through her choices about how to live and die, was perhaps her most important. That real happiness comes not from entertaining others or meeting their expectations, but from acts of authentic kindness performed without expectation of reward or recognition. In the end, Doris Day's greatest performance was learning to stop performing, and her most important song was the silence in which she finally found peace.